Whose story is this? It's a question you have to ask yourself every time you sit down to write a story. Which character will your story ultimately be about? And how do you decide? Today, a possible answer comes from Orson Scott Card's How to Write Fantasy and Science Fiction. Orson Scott Card is one of the most well-known sci-fi authors of the last half-century, most famous for Ender's Game and the sequence of books that followed from that. He also wrote the Alvin Maker series, which started with Seventh Son, moved on from there, and another book of his that I've read was called Enchantment, which is kind of an isekai-style, fairy tale, fable, modern, old-style fantasy type of story. So he's delved quite deeply into both sci-fi and fantasy, and he's very influential in the field. So I finally read his book on writing sci-fi and fantasy. There's some great stuff in here, including a new way to think about the focal character or characters in your story. Card begins the answer to whose story is this with, remember that the hero, the main character, and viewpoint character don't all have to be the same person. The hero is the character that the audience hopes will achieve his goals and desires, the character we're rooting for. There's a moral judgment involved here. We not only care what happens to him, we also want him to win. But the hero isn't always the main character. Sometimes the most important character in a story, the one who makes everything happen, the one whose choices and struggles the story is about, is a slimeball. And we watch him in horrified fascination, hoping somebody will stop this guy. Sometimes we even sympathize with him, pitying him, or even admiring some aspects of his character, but we still don't want him to achieve his goal. He goes on to say, it's often a good idea, when your main character is an anti-hero, to have secondary characters who can function as the focus of your reader's sympathy. In other words, heroes. They don't have to occupy center stage, but they often provide a clarifying moral center. However, if the point of your story is that there are no heroes, then this advice doesn't apply. Assemble your cast of rakes and racketeers, sleazeballs and slimeballs, wimps and wastrels, losers and liars, and have at it. Here we can see the difference between, say, Deadpool, where Deadpool is clearly an anti-hero, but he's surrounded by heroes like Colossus, versus, say, Breaking Bad, where ultimately, are there any good characters? But here are the three types of character that your story must have. And keep in mind that these don't necessarily need to be three different characters. We'll get back to that. First is the main character. Card says that we should consider a few questions when trying to figure this out. First, who hurts the most? In the world you have invented, who suffers the most? Chances are that it is among the characters who are in pain that you will find your main character, partly because your reader's sympathy will be drawn toward a suffering character, and partly because a character in pain is a character who wants things to change. He's likely to act. Your eye should be drawn toward pain. Stories about contented people are miserably dull. Nobody really wants to read a story about happy people being happy. That can be interesting for a brief time, but happy people, contented people, rarely need to change anything. And so there's rarely much action coming from them, which means there's rarely much of a story. So it doesn't mean that we need to see people be miserable, but we need to see people change. And usually, most of us want to see stories moving in a positive trajectory, from a negative to a positive. So we want that kind of positive change, although Breaking Bad situations can work in storytelling as well. They just require a little bit more craft. But either way, there needs to be some kind of dynamism, or the story's not interesting, which means characters in pain, people in pain, are the ones likely to be making choices to try to get themselves out of pain, which means they're the ones that our interest is going to be drawn towards. They're the ones we want to follow. Second question is, who has the power and freedom to act? Your main character usually needs to be somebody active, somebody who can change things in the world, even if it's a struggle. Remember that you look for people with both the power and freedom to act. And the greatest freedom to act in unpredictable ways is usually found away from the centers of power. So Card is kind of going against the grain of traditional fantasy and sci-fi here, where the main characters tend to be the kings or the nobles or the captains of the ship. Card says, no, that's probably not realistically a good main character, because in a real-world scenario, Kirk and Picard would never leave their ship to go on exploratory missions. They're the captains. Their job is to be on the ship. They have entire teams to send down. But that would make the show a lot less interesting if we didn't visit all those foreign planets. So they basically make those captains act in ways that no captain ever would in order to keep the show interesting. What he's saying here ultimately is characters who have the freedom to act usually are not those in authority, not those who are bound by their position. Their position leaves them more freedom. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have more power over others, but they have power over themselves, over their own actions and what they can do in regard to their situations. Or as Card says, the lives of commanders and kings are generally above the most interesting action. The really neat stuff is going to be happening to the people on the cutting edge. Frontline troops, scouts, the people who get beamed down to the planet's surface to find out what's going on. He goes on to point out other interesting character tropes. A character who is a loner or who leads a small group, a squad of soldiers, a single family, has so much more freedom to act than people in high office that it's far easier to tell stories about them. A good rule of thumb is to start with the assumption that your story is not about the king or president, the admiral or general, the CEO or the hospital administrator. Only move to the characters in the position of highest authority when you are forced to because the story can't be told any other way. And then be very sure that you understand how people in such positions make their decisions, how power actually works. So here he's talking about just keeping your veracity, making sure that you are being truthful in your storytelling. Who is your story about? A person who has a strong reason to want the situation to change and has both the power and freedom to set about trying to change it. So in choosing your main character, who's got the power and freedom to change the situation? Who actually wants it to change? What kind of pain, what kind of struggle are you going to put your main character through? And what kind of traits are you going to give him or her to get them to respond in a way that moves them in a positive direction towards changing that situation? The second character that Card talks about is the protagonist. And oftentimes we use the word protagonist and main character synonymously. But the protagonist and the main character are not always the same person, as Card is pointing out. For the protagonist, who do we hope succeeds? Usually you'll want your audience's sympathy to be with your main character, if only because it's a lot harder for a writer to make an anti-hero work well in a story. This book was published in 1991, before every character was an anti-hero. But sometimes you can't get away from the fact that wherever the action is, the story must follow. If all the important and interesting choices are being made by the bad guy, especially if the climax depends on what the bad guy does, chances are he's the main character of your story, whether you like it or not. So for this, Card uses the example of Return of the Jedi. Darth Vader really becomes the main character of the story, where Luke was the main character of the first two films. In the third one, Darth Vader's choices are what drive most of the action. I would disagree with him somewhat here. I think Luke's particular choices to go back to Dagobah, to go to the Death Star by himself and try to convert his father rather than try to kill him, those choices really are important choices that ultimately drive the story. But it is Vader's choice to save his son's life and throw the Emperor down the chute that ultimately saves the universe, is the ultimate controlling action of the entire story. Another example where the main character is not the protagonist, or the protagonist is not the hero, if we want to differentiate protagonist and hero, is Avengers Infinity War. Thanos is our main character. I would say he is the protagonist because he is the character that we follow through the main action of the film. I don't teach protagonist and main character as different ideas to my English students because I've never really thought of them differently. But protagonist and hero are different. The protagonist of American Psycho is Patrick Bateman, but nobody considers him the hero. The police officer, the antagonist, would be the hero of the story if there is one. The third character type is the viewpoint character. Now notice, all three of these characters could be one character. They could all be the same. And like Huckleberry Finn is our viewpoint character, first person point of view, narrator. He is our protagonist. We know he's trying to do the right thing, and ultimately he mostly does. And he is the main character because he's the only character we follow through all of the action of the story. But these could all be different characters as well. In The Great Gatsby, I don't think anyone really considers Nick the protagonist of The Great Gatsby. He is our viewpoint character, but Gatsby is the protagonist and potentially the main character as well. It's kind of hard to say which one is main, but the one who gets the most focus and the one who is present there for the central conflict of the story is Gatsby. Nick is just our reporter of that situation, even though we are with Nick for more of the story than we are with Gatsby. In the Sherlock Holmes tales, Watson is our viewpoint character. So we are seeing things through his eyes, not Holmes's eyes, which is important, because if we saw things through Holmes's eyes, we would figure out who done it a long time before this story was over, because Holmes usually knows it well before Watson finds it out. So, usually, your main character will be your viewpoint character. But the most important thing to remember is the viewpoint character is the person through whose eyes we see the action. If it's a first-person narrative, the viewpoint character is the person telling the tale. If it's a third-person narrative, then the viewpoint character is the person that we follow most closely, seeing not only what he does, but also why, seeing not only what he sees, but knowing how he interprets it, what he thinks about it. So why is it important to have a viewpoint character? You don't necessarily have to. This is only if you're writing in a first-person or third-person limited perspective. If you're writing in a third-person objective point of view, as in a camera, where you're not ever in any particular character's perspective, not in any character's thoughts, any character's feelings, any character's background, we don't have direct access to any character's internal life, as in we're watching a movie camera, that's a perfectly legitimate way to tell a story. Or you could do the omniscient point of view, which used to be much more popular, though it does have difficulties of its own, but in that point of view, we go into every character's head. There is no perspective that is closed off to us. This was very popular in 19th century novels. Not so popular today, because it does eliminate some strategies and techniques that a more limited viewpoint gives us, but still it is an option to do. But here Card is advocating for picking a viewpoint character, having a first person or a third person limited point of view. And he's not necessarily saying that you have to keep to that one viewpoint throughout the entire story. You could go back and forth between the viewpoint of the hero and the viewpoint of the villain. Let's say the example that he gives is Octavia Butler's Wild Seed. But there are other stories where you might think of that we go back and forth between the villain and the hero's point of view, or between multiple characters' point of view. George R. R. Martin uses a shifting limited third in all of his books. They have 5 or 6 viewpoint characters, and each one gets their chapters. You go rotate throughout those chapters as the book goes on. Each time you're in one character's point of view until that character dies. So what are the criteria for choosing a viewpoint character? Well, here are things to keep in mind. The viewpoint character must be present at the main events. The viewpoint character must be actively involved in those events, not always a chance witness. The viewpoint character must have a personal stake in the outcome, even though the outcome depends on the main character's choices. So, probably a good idea to follow all these as a rule of thumb. Could you have a character who reports events to us secondhand, is not present at those main events, but hears about them and reports them to us? Sure, but it's one more step of immediacy removed for the reader or audience, and it makes it one little bit harder to suspend our sense of disbelief. Does the viewpoint character have to be involved in those events? Not necessarily, but it's better for us to get involved in them. It's easier for us to empathize and put ourselves in the situation and commit to the story if the viewpoint character is a part of the events of the story, and they're not just an unaffected observer. Does the viewpoint character need a personal stake in the outcome? No, but again, we as readers are going to care more if he or she does. So, these are all good tips to keep in mind. But, of course, like any writing rules, they're like the Pirate's Code. And as Card says, Break the rules if you like, but make sure you understand the consequences and know how to turn them to your story's advantage. So when you're starting your next story project, keep these character roles in mind. Consider these questions when trying to fill these roles. Will my story have a protagonist or hero? That is, someone my audience wants to see win, someone they'll root for. Second, will my protagonist, whether it's a hero or no, be the main character, the one whose decisions drive the story? If not, who will that main character be? Third, what point of view will I write in, and who will be my viewpoint character, if any? What will showing the story through this character's perspective, or these characters' perspectives, if you have multiple viewpoint characters, do for the reader? What will it add to the story? I hope this gave you some food for thought, guys. I hope it helps you out with your next story project. Please leave comments or questions, suggestions down below. What do you think about viewpoint characters, protagonists, main characters? Are these all different roles to you, or should they all be the same? Is Orson Scott Card on to something, or is he just pontificating? Leave your comments down below. I'd love to get involved in the conversation. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good stuff. And thanks again for watching. Until next time, good luck and good writing. Peace.